I didn't even want to go. Frankly, I would have much rather stayed home, brewed myself some chamomile tea, pulled on some wool socks, and settled into the chair by the window where I usually spend my evenings, watching the wind rustle the maple trees in the yard. But the email arrived in my inbox at exactly 8:55 a.m. An email, of course, the kind that immediately makes it clear that you can't ignore it. The subject line was as terse and cold as a February morning in Michigan: dinner with the Carters, Friday, 6 p.m. It was a formal invitation from HR, complete with a tiny smiley face at the end, as if that little yellow face could make the whole situation seem friendly. After 25 years of helping grow CoreLogic Dynamics from a scrappy startup sharing a creaky desk in a rented warehouse to a $288 million global analytics firm, I wasn't invited to a board meeting, or a strategy session, or an investor call. Just dinner. Dinner with the CEO and his family. Like an invitation to a family gathering where you suddenly discover you're no longer part of the inner circle. My name is Abigail, and I was the first person ever hired at CoreLogic. Not a consultant, not a temp, not an intern. I was the one who manned the phones, answered clients, set up servers, did the accounting, picked out office paper, negotiated with contractors, and rebooted a frozen server at night when no one else was available. I didn't just work for this company, I lived it. I knew its strengths and weaknesses like the back of my hand. When we had just 2 clients and one old printer that would jam if you looked at it the wrong way, I kept it all afloat. I built client systems from scratch, negotiated contracts, and sized up budgets down to the last cent until we could finally afford to hire a real CFO. I negotiated, kept things running smoothly, and knew where we could cut corners to make it to the next quarter. Ronald Carter, the company's founder, often called me his silent engine. He liked to say, when everything around you is about to fall apart, you're the one keeping the engine running. But in recent months, everything had changed. Ronald had become distant. My updates went unread, as if words no longer mattered. Our usual Monday meetings first became quick video calls, then Slack messages, then something called, "Let's reschedule until indefinitely." And then they showed up. The interns. Young, loud, with new laptops and branded water bottles. Full of buzzwords that sometimes gave me a headache: disrupt, synergy, agility to scale. It was like they'd reinvented the business and I was a museum piece. So when that invitation came, I knew something was up. I just hadn't realized how cold the wind could get when you were told your season was over. The restaurant was one of those trendy rooftop spots in the middle of town that I'd never go to on my own. Overpriced, button-sized food, dim, almost theatrical lighting, and servers who spoke in hushed tones. I put on my soft navy blouse and the pearl earrings my daughter had given me for Mother's Day. They've always given me a sense of inner toughness, like armor hidden in grace. I looked like I always did, polished, professional, ready for anything. Ronald was already there, standing at a long white table with his wife, Sarah, and their daughter, Frances. Frances looked like she'd stepped out of a luxury commercial: perfect blonde hair, impeccable linen suit, polished charm. Her LinkedIn profile screamed, "Future CEO." Abigail. Ronald said with a wide, tight smile, his arms outstretched in a gesture that had once been warm but now felt theatrical. "I'm so glad you could make it." "I wouldn't have missed it," I said, sitting down across from him, my stomach in knots. It had been a typical corporate dinner at first: too much wine, too many empty compliments, conversations where every word sounded like a carefully rehearsed line. Frances, head bowed, asked me about the early days of the company. Her tone was polite, almost affectionate, but there was a hint of mockery in it, as if she were looking at an old family photo and not believing that it had ever been considered fashionable. "It's so funny to think of you working in a garage somewhere," she giggled. I smiled politely. It hadn't been funny at the time. Ronald interjected, clearly trying to lend weight to the conversation, as if he wanted to restore my lost reputation. "Abigail actually saved the company twice. She brought us our first defense contract, and with it, our first million." Frances just smirked. "Well, every company needs its building blocks." I should have left then. Everything in my body was telling me to get up, pay up, leave. But I stayed. I wanted to see how far they would go. After I'd eaten half the halibut, and the polite corporate cacophony was all around me, Ronald suddenly folded his arms and looked at me as if he were about to offer me peace or something more. "Abigail, we're in the business of long-term planning," he began, choosing his words with the care of someone who knows he's about to say something that might hurt. "You've been invaluable in getting CoreLogic to where it is today." There it was. The heart of the story. But he continued, "As we prepare for the next phase of the company's development, we believe it's time to bring in new energy and a new vision." I kept my expression calm, and even the corners of my lips twitched slightly in an elusive smile, the one I usually wore when someone in a meeting was trying to explain my own system to me. At such moments, I didn't raise my voice, didn't object, didn't argue. I just watched until their own understanding came. Ronald, as if sensing that I wasn't going to make a scene, perked up a little, and, as if to prove his point, he added with genuine pride, but also a hint of justification, "Francis had just completed the Stanford Executive Education Program." He said it as if a Stanford degree automatically opened the door to a world of management revelations. "She was full of great ideas," he said, "blockchain, artificial intelligence, brand modernization." He listed them all as if he were pulling jewels from a box, hoping that at least one of the shiny terms would dazzle me. "Impressive," I said with the same easy smile, which held no irony or sarcasm, only the calm and delicacy with which one wipes spilled wine on a tablecloth. "What's the transition plan?" I asked, and for the first time all evening, he seemed to allow himself to breathe a sigh of relief. He sighed with relief, almost paternally, as if we had finally come to an understanding. 7 weeks, he said. "She will follow you. We will make an official announcement after the next quarterly meeting." He paused, choosing his words. "And, of course, we have prepared a generous severance package. We want you to feel valued." At that moment, as if on cue, Frances leaned forward, fork in hand, and there was something in her eyes that I recognized immediately, plead disguised as charm. "Time to step aside, Granny," she said, with a grin that seemed to cut the air between us. The table fell silent. Even Sarah's fork hovered in midair, suspended over her plate, frozen in a moment of awkwardness from which she could no longer emerge unscathed. I looked at Frances for a long moment, and in that silence, decades passed between us. Burned servers, sleepless nights, early clients, a collapsing market, my broken copier that I fixed with a pencil and duct tape. Then I smiled. "I completely understand," I said. Neither Ronald nor Frances knew, or even cared to check, that CoreLogic was more than just a company I had helped create. I quietly but surely owned a part of her, the part they had forgotten but I never had. In 1990, when CoreLogic was still struggling, when we had less than $300 in our accounts and my cheeks were black and blue from lack of sleep, Ronald walked into my office, his eyes red and his hands shaking. We had almost lost our biggest client to a billing error, and I had worked all night in the office, recreating all the paperwork by hand. He came over and handed me a single piece of paper. "Abigail," he said, "I can't pay you what you deserve, at least not yet. But if we survive, I want you to get your share." At the time, it seemed like a thank you card, the kind of token of appreciation you tuck into an envelope with a bottle of wine. I didn't even bother to read it carefully, too tired, too dedicated, too hopeful. But years later, when we finally started raising outside money, I had our lawyer review every document I'd ever signed. And then I realized, this wasn't a symbol. This was real. I had equity. I had a voice. I had ownership. I never brought it up. I didn't brag. I didn't remind Ronald. I didn't need to. I thought I was still part of the soul of this company, its invisible rhythm, its connective tissue. But the basic logic had changed, and so had Ronald. He stopped asking my opinion, stopped caring about my observations, and started chasing trends, flashy presentations, people who could talk beautifully, even if their words were based on nothing more than a shiny LinkedIn profile. Consultants came and went, but those who endlessly admired Frances's resume and her ability to use the term marketing reincarnation remained. Suddenly, everything that had once mattered, loyalty, results, dedication, no longer mattered. Only appearances mattered. and I no longer looked like the future. But I still owned a piece of the present. The following Monday, I went to work as if nothing had happened. I smiled at Tammy at the front desk, as I had every day for 20 years. I poured myself a black coffee from the same old machine, still hissing like a steam locomotive, and checked my email. No notifications, no changes, just silence, as icy as the sky before a storm. Austin, our data engineer, poked his head into my office. He gave me the wary, inquiring look he usually gave me when he sensed something was about to break. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded. "Just dinner with the Carters." He winced. "People are talking. They're confused." I met his gaze. "Let them be surprised," I said. I wasn't ready to reveal everything yet. Not yet. Instead, I logged into the shareholder portal. My stake, that 8% that had once seemed like a gesture of gratitude, was still there, untouched, solid as a foundation on which to build anew. And thanks to new investors, thanks to the company's growth, thanks to everything I'd ever laid on the altar of this job, that tiny piece had become truly valuable. I downloaded everything, from shareholder agreements to board votes to executive compensation reports, going through each document slowly, carefully, as if I were reading the chapters of my own biography, knowing that between the lines lay my story, my contribution, my protection. That night, to the sound of the ceiling fan slowly spinning and the lulling tick of the old wall clock, I sent an email to Ronald's assistant. Short, no nonsense. "I'd like to speak to Ronald. 25 minutes. It'll be just the two of us." She responded a couple hours later, blinking back a single, "I'll see what I can do," and I sensed something more in her brevity. Maybe she already knew this meeting was coming, but needed time to accept it. On Wednesday, I was sitting in Ronald's office. He looked up from the pile of papers in front of him and tried to give me that warm, slightly apologetic smile I'd seen hundreds of times before, especially over the years when he needed someone to stay past 6. "Abigail," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him, as if we were just going to discuss another presentation. "How are you?" "Curious," I said, folding my hands in my lap, as if I were about to ask a simple, everyday question. "You didn't mention the shares I still own on Saturday." His smile vanished, as if someone had turned off a light. "I assumed you'd cash them in by now." "I didn't," I said, and placed a printed shareholder agreement on his desk, underlining in bold the clause that mentioned my voting rights. "And unless I'm missing something, I still have the right to participate in the decisions." He folded his hands, steepling his fingers in the way he always did when he was trying to appear reserved. "Abigail, this doesn't have to be complicated. We're offering you a very generous exit." "I'm not leaving," I said quietly, keeping my voice down, just letting the words fall between us like an uninvited witness. "Not yet. I'll support the transition. I'll do it respectfully. But if Francis is planning a restructuring, bringing in his own people, or selling off assets, I want a seat at the table." He frowned, as if I'd broken an unspoken agreement of dutiful gratitude. "You're holding on out of nostalgia." "No," I said calmly. "I'm holding on to what I built." Then I stood up and left without waiting for him to think of anything to say. Let him sit with that. Let him remember who I was. That evening, after brewing myself a strong ginger tea, I pulled out an old, dusty file cabinet from my home office. The metal drawer creaked, as if protesting my rummaging through the past. Inside were fragments of another era, sketches of an early client system, notes from meetings, interface mock-ups drawn on napkins at roadside cafes where we discussed plans between orders of coffee and sandwiches. And then, at the bottom of the drawer, under tattered notepads and paper tabs, I found something I hadn't seen in years, a non-disclosure agreement Ronald had signed back in 1990, acknowledging that several key tools I'd developed for CoreLogic were originally based on work I'd done in my previous consulting practice. It was the fine print most people ignore. But I hadn't forgotten. Not then. And I certainly didn't now. The next day, I met with Julie, an old friend and now one of the most respected intellectual property lawyers in the city. We picked a quiet, cozy spot just 3 blocks from CoreLogic's headquarters and, as always, ordered the same thing, her favorite quinoa salad and my usual tomato soup with crusty bread. I handed her a thick folder, heavy, almost a weight in my hands, filled with old contracts, notes, drawings, articles, and letters. "Can I protect this?" I asked. Julie flipped through the pages slowly, carefully, as if she were reading my handwriting, absorbing not just the letters but all the nights that stood behind them. Her expression remained focused but calm until she put the last page down and smiled. "Abigail, you own this. At least part of it. And with your stock, you have more leverage than they ever expected." I exhaled, and it felt like 17 years of weight had been lifted off my chest, leaving not pain but confidence in its wake. "They think I'm just a stepping stone." "Then let's remind them," Julie said, "that even stepping stones can shake the foundation." By the end of the week, the whispers had begun. Why was Abigail still here? Why was she so calm? Why hadn't Frances taken over yet? I simply smiled as I passed them in the hall, the same way I had passed them in 2005, when I'd won the defense contract that put us in the black for the first time. They thought that dinner would be the end of me. They missed the point. I was writing the next chapter. By Monday, Frances had unofficially taken up residence in my office. She would show up early, almost at dawn, bringing coffee with a tight, almost forced smile, pretending we were partners, that there was no tension between us, no past hurts. But her tone was sweet in the carefully rehearsed way they teach you in business courses, and beneath her soft questions I could hear the sharp edges. She asked about suppliers, about the vulnerabilities in our systems, about the budget, as if she had already written a plan that didn't include me. And looking into her eyes, I could see that she didn't just want to run the company. She wanted to write me out of its history. She wasn't here to learn. That had been obvious since that first week, when her footsteps began to sound in the hallway before mine, when her name began to appear in email chains that had erased mine, when her voice began to sound more confident in meetings than her expertise required. No, Frances wasn't here to learn, to listen, to ask questions. She was here to replace. To cross out. To put a period where I wrote a comma. "Do you always approve budget requests manually?" she asked one morning, standing at my desk with a report in her hands that, judging by the furrow in her brow, she barely understood. "Always," I replied calmly, without looking up from the screen. "It catches mistakes. Automation doesn't. It just gives confidence to those who can't doubt." She hesitated, then raised her eyebrows with exaggerated politeness and said, "But if we use forecasting tools, isn't that more reliable?" "They're only as good as the data they're based on," I said slowly, as if explaining algebra to a schoolgirl. "Some of our old clients are still using 11-year-old systems. Garbage in, garbage out." She blinked, not understanding the phrase, and smiled. "You're a little old-fashioned, aren't you?" There it was. The polite mask slipped, revealing a condescending incomprehension. I smiled back. Being old-fashioned has helped this company survive 3 recessions. But of course, learned the hard way. She didn't like it. I saw the muscles in her face tighten, the fist clenching under the table. She wasn't used to being told she was wrong. Especially women over 50. She scheduled her first strategy session for Wednesday. I wasn't invited. The entire leadership team had received an email with the subject line, Vision 5.1, CoreLogic's future starts now. Except me. Austin forwarded it to me with a short note, "Thought you might want to see this." Sweet. I opened the agenda and immediately saw familiar markers: new branding, aggressive hiring, and serious outsourcing of internal services. I couldn't help but laugh out loud. Half of our customers' loyalty was built not on flashy presentations but on the stability of the back end, which we cherished, nurtured, and hand-tuned like an old piano. We didn't just sell pretty dashboards, we were the ones who kept them online when everything else went down. Frances didn't understand this. All she knew was the tale her father had told her, whispered over brunch at the lake house. A story in which I was a bit part of it, not the author. Later that day, Ronald stopped by my desk. He hadn't done so in years. His walk, once confident, was now slow, and his smile was the same one he used in negotiations, political, measured. "Abigail," he said, "I want this transition to go smoothly. Francis is already becoming very visible." "Visibility is not knowledge," I answered without hesitation. He paused. For a long time. We both knew that sentence was the death knell for the new era. "You've always been the soul of this place," he said finally, "and you accepted an invitation to dinner to rip the soul out of it?" I cut him off, looking him straight in the eye. He winced. "That's not it. Then what is it, Ronald?" "Because I'm the one who built these systems. I'm the one who kept the investors from running when everything was falling apart. I held this place together when you were in Napa, vacationing. And I know about the Series C split," I added, not giving him time to catch his breath. His eyes widened. "How?" "I've been around long enough to know when the wind changes." He didn't deny it. He just stared at the floor, like a boy caught in the act of deception. "We had to make a tough choice," he muttered. "The board needs a fresh face. A new story." "A story in which I am no longer in it," I prompted. He hesitated. "We are offering you a package." "I am not interested in your package," I said, standing up. "I am interested in what I owe you." I left without letting him finish. Back in the office, I immediately sent Julie an email. Subject: provisional patents, due end of week. I wanted protection not just for the old systems, but for all the improvements, all the ideas I had made year after year, subtly but fundamentally. This was not sabotage. It was a line. A line that could not be crossed. Anything with my fingerprints on it had to be protected by law. Thursday morning, I saw Frances at the board, drawing a diagram of her new customer retention model. I walked closer and almost laughed. What she was scribbling in Sharpie was almost verbatim a section of a strategy document I'd written 5 years ago, the night before the biggest contract in the company's history. She must have dug into the archives. Good. Very good. Let her keep digging, I thought, watching Frances copy ideas from my old document and claim them as her own on the board in the conference room with animated concentration. Because while she was looking for shortcuts, rummaging through the archives like a treasure chest of forgotten treasures, I was already plotting my next move, building it as carefully as I had built the architecture of our systems in years past, with the same attention to detail, the same cold determination, the patience learned from years of working in environments where one mistake could cost us the contract. When she noticed me standing by the door, watching, she immediately squared her shoulders and turned to me with a forced, almost sleazy smile. "I'm just streamlining my work," she said, with the air of someone who has just invented the wheel. "It's given me a solid foundation." I took a step closer and smiled back, calmly, without aggression, but in a tone I knew would cut deeper than a direct accusation. "No problem. Just make sure you give credit where it's due. Plagiarism doesn't look good on quarterly reports." Her smile faltered, not right away, but enough for me to notice. By Friday, the whispers in IT had begun. They were subtle, cautious, like the breeze before a storm. Katie, my operations manager and one of the few who had stayed with me since the early server rooms, spotted me in the break room. She came closer, looked around, and whispered, "They're nervous. Francis is pushing through changes that won't work, and Ronald isn't saying anything." I set my mud down and looked her straight in the eye. "That's because Ronald isn't running anything anymore. He just hasn't realized it yet." Katie stared at me, frowning. "What are you doing, Abigail?" I smiled and began setting the table, a ritual gesture, and said, as if I were talking about the weather, "For what?" "For the storm." And then, almost jokingly, "But don't worry, I'll still smile." That evening, I sat on my porch, my bare feet touching the cold floorboards, a glass of red wine in my hand, my laptop in my lap. The letters had already been drafted, proofread, filed. One was addressed to the remaining 5 board members, reminding them of my equity, the 8% I still owned, and the clause in the original agreement requiring unanimous approval for any major structural changes. The second was Nextra Systems, the very company we'd almost acquired last year. I still had a good relationship with their CEO, and now I needed a meeting. The third element of my pitch was the subject line itself. I was saving everything, just in case. I didn't want a war. I wanted recognition. But if they pressed me, they'd see how old-fashioned I could be when the situation called for it. The formal announcement came on Tuesday morning. The obligatory all-staff meeting. The entire office gathered in the large conference room where we'd once held meaningful strategy sessions. Now the stage was set for a show. Frances stood at the front of the room, wireless microphone in hand, pacing back and forth like she was giving a TED Talk, exuding the confidence of someone who knows they've already been chosen. Behind her, a slideshow flashed, stock photos, smiling people, graphs with slanted arrows, and empty corporate jargon, vision, speed, win. Ronald introduced her with a wide, tight smile, calling her a breath of fresh air, as if she were a scented candle rather than an executive. Frances beamed, as if she were standing at the podium wearing a crown. And then she said it. "It's time for a new chapter," she began. "A younger, more efficient, more innovative core logic." This was it, I thought. Not even an attempt at subtlety. I sat in the second row, arms crossed, looking not at her but at the faces in the room. Most looked confused, some looking at the floor, some at me. Katie looked stunned. Austin didn't even dare catch my eye. Then Frances pointed to the screen, and a new slide appeared. Organizational Optimization Plan, Phase 1. My jaw clenched. The screen depicted their future. Back-end cuts. Merging outsourced IT departments. And worst of all, transition to legacy management is their coded way of saying we're removing Abigail. They didn't even bother to mention my name. After the meeting, when the room had emptied, Frances found me alone in the hallway. She walked slowly, confidently, as if she knew she had won. "I hope you can understand this," she said quietly, looking me straight in the eye. "This is what people expect from seasoned professionals." I inclined my head slightly. "You mean the women who have outlived 4 CEOs and built the systems that allow this company to survive?" She didn't answer, just smiled again, the smile they use when they want to make it clear that you've been written off. That same day, HR sent me a termination package, a fat check, a non-disclosure agreement, and a clause requiring my full cooperation in transferring all knowledge. That's where they went too far. I walked into Ronald's office with the package in my hand, feeling like every minute of this meeting was forming a chain that would either snap or tie itself in a knot, but not around my neck. He seemed to have already prepared himself for the consequences, because he didn't try to get up, didn't make the ostentatious gesture he had before, didn't offer me a chair, didn't ask how I was feeling. He just looked. "Abigail," he began, his voice weary, the forced calm that comes from people who feel the ground slowly slipping away from under their feet. "You let your daughter stand on that stage and pretend that this was her idea." I set the package on the edge of his desk and looked him straight in the eye. "You let her call me obsolete in front of the entire company. And now you want me to hand it over to you like some loyal but obsolete employee." He tried to protest. "That's not true," he began. "That's exactly it," I snapped, keeping my voice low but putting into each word the strength I'd had to pluck up over the decades. "Let me be clear. I'm not signing anything. Not today. Ever." He sighed, as if he were trying to shake off the weight of responsibility but didn't know how. "Then you leave us no choice," he said. "You're forgetting something," I said, pulling a document out of my bag, neatly folded, with marker tabs around the edges. "I still have a seat on the board. Try to oust me without the board's approval, and you'll be breaking the original agreement." Ronald went pale. Something I hadn't seen in a long time crossed his face, fear mixed with the knowledge that he'd lost control. "You think Frances's ideas sound fresh and exciting," I continued, not giving him time to justify himself. "But they're dangerous. Cutting out the back end cripples your infrastructure, and that fancy automation model she keeps talking about violates customer contracts. And you know it." He leaned back, closing his eyes, as if hoping the silence between us would change everything. "I'm not trying to sink this ship," I added more gently. "But I'm not going to let it drag me down." That evening, I met Katie and Austin at a quiet diner across town, where no one knew us and asked too many questions. We sat by the window, and I handed them each a manila envelope. "What is this?" Katie asked, frowning. "Proof," I said, sipping my coffee. "What we built isn't just code. It's intellectual property. Documented, time-stamped, traceable." Austin looked at me with alarm. "Are you going to sue them?" "Not unless they make me," I said. "I just want you both to be protected." I told them. "Francis is already planning a second round of layoffs." Katie nodded slowly. "The PR team is already working on a press release. They're cleaning house for the sale," I said. "Core logic is being refined, optimized, and packaged as a showpiece." Austin looked up. "Are you going to stop it?" "No," I said calmly. "I'm going to shape it." I worked quietly for the next 5 days, like a ghost. I showed up early, left late, made no noise, didn't argue, but every action was measured and purposeful. I met with Julia again and submitted a formal letter demanding that she cease and desist from reusing proprietary code in Francis's new designs. I also sent a letter to the board, stating my intention to vote against the restructuring unless there was a neutral, independent review. And then I met Nextra's CEO for lunch. It was a friendly get-together. We talked about the weather, old times, technology. But when I casually mentioned the leadership change at Core Logic, he raised an eyebrow. "They're getting ready to sell," I said. He nodded. "That explains why several of their people have approached us." I smiled. "If you're interested, I can tell you exactly which systems are worth protecting. And who really knows how they work." By Friday, the pressure on Francis was mounting. Her voice in meetings was strident, like a string stretched to breaking point. Her smiles were strained, and there was a look of worry in her eyes, the kind that even perfectly applied makeup can't hide. The confidence she relied on was fading. The people she relied on were slowly turning to look at me. And I just kept smiling, because while she was raising a storm, I was already building flood dams. By Monday, 4 of her big ideas had fallen apart. The vendor migration she'd promised as a cost-saving measure had turned out to be a bust. The integration had to be delayed due to technical issues. In fact, Austin, without a word, had quietly pulled the plug on an old patch, the one he'd written years ago that was key to the entire system. The rebranding plan was put on hold. The legal department flagged it as a trademark infringement against another tech company, one I happened to know a long time ago. I knew the owner personally. We'd once sat together on boring panels in Seattle, discussing who would be the first to solve the problem of digital obsolescence and interfaces. Perhaps I was the one who gave them the tip-off. Just a quick reminder, with an attachment and everything neatly highlighted. The new predictive analytics model that Francis had been pushing so aggressively as the next evolution of logic had failed in its first real-world testing. It hadn't just failed to work, it had collapsed like a house of cards soaked in rain. Just as I'd warned, garbage in, garbage out. But Francis hadn't stopped. On the contrary, as if taking a deep breath, she doubled down. That afternoon, she called a mandatory meeting of all department heads, and as we gathered in the conference room, I noticed her hands shaking slightly, despite the wide, tight smile she was forcing herself to wear like a shield. "We're going through some growing pains," she said, with the kind of forced confidence they teach at fancy business schools. "But we're on the right track. Disruptions are never comfortable." I raised an eyebrow at the back of the room. "Disruption only works with a parachute." "You've destroyed every safety net this company had," I said evenly, and the room went silent, thick as the damp air before a storm. Frances smiled tightly, her chin quivering. "Thank you for your feedback, Abigail." Ronald, sitting off to the side, said nothing. He didn't even try anymore, just sat hunched in his chair, like a man watching his own ship sailing into an iceberg but unable to turn the rudder. After the meeting, Katie came up to me. We exchanged a quick glance, and she lowered her voice slightly. "We had 5 long-standing clients call today. They're concerned. One of them flat out said he'd leave if their service was cut again." I sighed, containing my irritation. Let me guess. Frances hasn't responded to their emails? Katie shook her head. She thinks they'll wait. I shook my head back. They won't. These people have been building relationships with us for years. They're leaving quietly but decisively. That evening, I sat down at the kitchen table, turned on my laptop, and wrote an email to Brian Hughes, Nexra's CEO. The subject line, follow-up to our lunch group. The body of the email simply said, if you're serious about this, now is the time to act. Brian and his board had been hanging around CoreLogic for months, watching, waiting for the right moment. I wasn't trying to sabotage anything. I was just holding up a mirror, so they could see for themselves what was going on behind the scenes. The next morning, I found Frances in my old office. She was sitting with her feet up on my old desk, idly tossing a stress ball into the air, as if everything that had once mattered to me was now just furniture. She didn't even look up when I knocked on the door. "Can I help you?" she asked, as if I were one of the internships. "I need a few minutes," she said, with a haughty weariness. "Let's get going." I stepped forward, calmly, confidently, with the grace with which I always walked into the boardrooms where the fate of our company was being decided. "You're losing the company," I said. That got her attention. She put her feet on the floor. "I know you think people will follow you because you talk about innovation and branding. But this company wasn't built on slogans. It was built on trust. And systems that actually work." She stood up, narrowing her eyes. "Are you threatening me?" "No," I said. "I'm giving you a chance." "A chance to do what?" "To stop pretending you know what you're doing." She chuckled, but there was no longer the same fire in her eyes. "My father is being sidelined by the board. That makes you as much of a figurehead as he is." I paused, then said, "You want to run it? Fine. But don't burn down the foundation to prove you can light a match." She didn't answer. I didn't expect her to. Later that day, Ronald himself asked for a private meeting, without his aides, without Frances. We met in a small conference room we rarely frequented. He looked tired, the skin around his eyes sagging, as if the days were dragging on in another dimension for him. "Abigail," he said, sitting down across from me. "What do you want?" I took a deep breath, because I knew now was the time to say it out loud. "I want recognition. Not a check, not a title, just some earned credit." He rubbed his hands over his face. "The board is scared," he said. "They see the cracks. And your name is still attached to every major system." "They should be scared," I said calmly. "They gave control of a multimillion-dollar company to a guy who viewed experience as a weakness." He thought for a moment. "What about Nexra?" he asked. "I had lunch with Brian. The offer is real, but I didn't say yes," I said. He looked at me seriously. "You can leave." "I could," I said, not looking away. "But I won't. What I built still matters. And if they want to keep using it, they'll do it on my terms." That evening, as the sunset slid across my roof and the kettle made that cozy whistle that always reminds you of the silence that comes after a storm, a short text from Katie arrived. Just a few words. "Clientex has just sent a formal communication to the board." I read it like a sip of strong coffee and responded simply, "Hang in there." Frances had the microphone, but I had the power. And I knew I was just a few steps away from changing everything. The boardroom was packed, people were seated closer together than usual, and the air was tense, like before a storm. It was an emergency meeting, urgent, necessary, almost urgent. Everyone was there, senior management, investors, key partners. So was I. Frances sat leafing through a notebook that, I noticed, was empty. Just an appearance. Across from me sat Brian from Nexra, calm, almost indifferent in appearance, but with the awareness of a predator waiting for the right moment. Hannah, the chairwoman, spoke first. Her voice was clear, confident, sharp as a surgeon's knife. "Abigail has raised serious technical, legal, and operational issues, things we hadn't seen before," she said. Several heads turned in my direction, and a few nodded slightly. Hannah continued, "Any management change that affects major shareholders requires full board approval." Then she turned to me. "Abigail, do you want to speak?" I stood up calmly, without unnecessary gestures, without papers, without slides, just with a directness that in itself was my strength. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I've given this company more than 17 years. I built it not for show, but with faith in what I was doing. But somehow that devotion became invisible. I'm not asking for a title. I'm asking for respect. I want a company led by those who understand that the strength is in its foundation." The room froze, silent for a second, as if the building itself had decided to listen. Then Brian spoke. His voice was measured, but it carried a verdict. "We've seen the consequences. Clients are worried. Contracts are on hold. And the underlying logic systems are not as robust as claimed." He turned to Francis. "Our offer remains open. But only with stable leadership." It was a moment of truth. It was clear that Francis had to go. Hannah called a 15-minute break. Most people left. I stayed in the room. Francis did too. She approached me slowly, almost hesitantly. "I didn't want to screw this up," she said quietly. I nodded. "I know you wanted to prove yourself. But you didn't ask what needed to be fixed. You treated people like barriers. And you treated me like I didn't matter." She looked at me with sudden vulnerability. "What now?" she asked. "That's up to the board," I said. When we returned, Hannah stood and made a decision. Effective immediately, Francis would step down as leader. Ronald would remain as an advisor for the duration of the transition. Then she looked at me. "Abigail Carter. You've been asked to lead a transition advisory group reporting directly to the board and senior partners of Nextra." I didn't smile. I just nodded. No triumph, no pride. Only the peace that comes from knowing you did it right. Later that week, I signed my consulting contract. It paid 4 times my previous salary. I was given complete control over systems integration during the acquisition. No strings attached, no holds barred. Francis was gone. No word, no goodbye letter, no meeting. Just gone, like someone who never knew what they were touching. Before we left the building, Ronald found me in the lobby. He shook my hand, and there was no trace of arrogance in his eyes. Just regret. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know," I said. 3 months later, CoreLogic was officially part of Nextra. Most of the staff stayed. I handpicked the new leadership team. Kathy became COO. Austin became head of engineering. Half the company now reported to the people I had once mentored, championed. I never went back to my old office. Instead, I set up a workspace at home, at a small desk by the window overlooking the lake, where steam rose slowly from the surface of the water in the mornings and birds cried in the pines, as if calling me back to life. Twice a week, I would walk barefoot onto the terrace with a cup of coffee, wrapped in a soft cardigan, and watch the sun rise over the horizon while client dashboards loaded on my screen, the systems I had once built still running in the background, as reliable, as stable as ever. One evening, when the silence seemed almost musical, an email arrived from Hannah. The subject line was "Legacy." Inside, a few simple lines: "Abigail, what you did, how you did it, we've never seen anything like it. You didn't just protect your legacy. You reminded everyone what real leadership looks like." I sat there for a while, just staring at the screen, letting the words sink in. It was never about revenge. It was never about power. It was about knowing your worth, standing up for it, and never, under any circumstances, letting anyone take it away from you.